Hello, today I'm going to be trying something a little bit different to what I usually do. I'm going to be making a sculpture of an arrow. I'm tending to call a lot of things sculptures nowadays, but effectively all that I'm going to be doing today is making an arrow but entirely out of steel. So I'm sort of basing this off a few different historical examples, and as I'm going along I'll explain why I'm doing certain things in a certain way and how that correlates to the specific arrows that I'm basing this design off of. I'm just going to start from one end and work my way down to the other. I'll begin with the head, then the shaft, then the fletchings, and then we can put it all together. I've got a piece of 12mm round in the fire, and for the head I'm going to be basing it off of a Viking era sort of an arrow. And so the Vikings tended to use tanged arrowheads. You can either have tanged or socketed, and a tanged arrowhead has a piece of steel which goes into the shaft, whereas a socketed arrowhead obviously goes over the top of the shaft. The Vikings also preferred a leaf shape to the point rather than say like a bodkin style of a head, which, you know, that just has a four-sided taper. The Vikings preferred a much flatter leaf-like, more like a spear head on the top of the arrow. I'm going to forge the point out first and then come back and forge the shoulder in and the tang. If this head were to go into a wooden shaft, we would leave the tang square. We would point it off a little bit more and then leave it square, and that sort of, it helps it not to spin, because obviously if it's round it can pivot on an axis, whereas if it's square it can't turn at all. I mean, that's sort of like a fail-safe if the head ever comes loose. But because we're doing this into a steel shaft, the way that I've thought up to attach it is by cutting a thread on this piece and drilling and tapping a hole in the shaft, and then we can just literally screw the head onto the end. But obviously to do that we don't need this square, we need it round. So I thought I'd just explain that. So if this was being made traditionally to put into a wooden arrow, we would leave it square, but as it happens I'm doing it into a steel shaft, so I need to cut a thread on the end, therefore it's got to be a round tang. Here's the arrowhead as forged. I'm really happy with how it's turned out, but I'm going to do some bench work on it just to true up everything so we can profile the edge a little bit, work on the bevels, just make sure that they're nice and neat. Come to the shoulder, true that up with a file, and then trim the tangs to length and cut some threads on it. I'll chuck this back in the fire so we can get some scale forming over the sections where we've polished it up, and then we can just give it a quick wire brush and that'll be this piece done. Now we can move on to the shaft, and so I'm going to be basing this off of a Mary Rose arrow, and so the Mary Rose was a ship that sank during Tudor time, 16th century, and so that's when this sort of part of the arrow is going to be based off of. I mean, the Vikings may well have done arrows very similar to this, but for the dimensions it's going to be 12mm round bar. However, it's going to be a barrel shape, so the sides aren't going to be parallel. It's going to be 12mm in the middle, and then down to the knock and the head they're going to be 10mm. So there's a slight taper on both ends, and then what I'm going to do is texture it in my wood texturing tool. I think this is going to add a bit of sort of 3D-ness to the piece and mean that it's not just completely flat on the surface and it looks a bit more like wood. We are going to be exaggerating the fact that it's made of wood with this texturing tool, but I think it's going to look pretty cool on the end piece. Sometimes they didn't just do a barrel shape, sometimes they had it 12mm in the middle, then going back to the fletchings it was also 12mm to the knock, and then going to the front where the point is, it was then tapering down to more like 10mm. So there's loads of different variations, and I mean those arrows are all found on the same ship at the same time, and so you know, you can look at that, and in that time period they were using several different styles of arrows and all different lengths as well. I think the shortest was 24 inch and the longest was 32 inches. So we're going to go sort of in between that. I think probably an overall length of 30 inch, but there's sort of a wide variety of different arrows, and obviously it all depends on the person shooting them, because it's all your draw length and the size of the bow. It's all dependent on your body. Anyway, I'll get a piece of steel in the fire and then we can go from there. As I said, I'm going to be putting some texturing onto this shaft. So I've got this tool, which is a spring swage, and the dies, you can't really see them, but they have chisel lines cut into both of them. So this can go into the hardie hole. We can put a wedge in through the bottom of the shank to clamp it down, and then we can feed our bar in, hammer on it, turn the bar, and it'll add texture to the shaft. Now we've got that end of the bar all forged and textured, I'll flip it around and do the same to the other side. I've got the shaft in the vise and I've trimmed the end so we've got a nice flat surface. I'm going to try mark the middle. Then we can drill this out to 3.5mm and then tap it with our 4mm thread so that our head will just screw in to the end. Now we have a thread cut in this end. I can flip the bar over and I'm going to just centre punch a mark about 1/2 inch from the end. And so that I'm going to drill a hole, probably about 4.5mm, maybe 5mm hole, and then we can cut in and that'll be our knock. And I'm going to drill a hole so that we have a nice radius on the inside of the knock. Traditionally, they would have slotted in about a 2-inch section of cow horn to strengthen the knock, because otherwise, literally the draw weight, the force coming from the string of the bow could split the arrows. So they had to put in a little bit of cow horn, or I mean, generally it was cow horn that they used, something a little bit stronger than the wood, to go in there to prevent the arrows from splitting. However, I'm not going to do that, as I don't really know what material I would be putting in here or how to put it in. So I'm just going to cut a knock in, and then after that we can move on to the fletchings. Moving on to the fletchings, you can see I've already got 2 cut out. This one I'm going to use as a template for the next. They're just out of 2mm sheet, so you can put that one on there, trace around it with some chalk, and then cut it out. And afterwards, we can then put some chisel marks onto it, just some lines, to give it a bit of texture and make it a bit more like a feather. Now, here's something that's interesting. It's something that I didn't account for when I was cutting these blanks, is that they've all turned out different lengths. Because, you can see there, they're all slightly different lengths. But that's because when we're putting the chisel in, we're displacing material. So if I didn't do the exact same amount of cuts in each of the blanks and the exact same depth, then over the course of whatever this is, 7 inches, it's going to displace a different amount of material, and therefore the lengths are going to change, which is something that I did not account for. So I'm going to have to come back now and just trim the ends and make sure that they're all the same length. To finish off these fletchings, what I'm going to do is take a wire wheel in an angle grinder and just polish them up a little bit. I've got the head screwed in, and I made sure to put a little bit of super glue in the joint so that this doesn't unscrew or come loose. I'm going to take a flat wheel now and just come and carefully feather in the joint here, as this head is about 1/2 mil maybe off of the actual shaft, so I need to just grind it down a little bit. Then we can come back and polish all of this up. Traditionally, this part of the shaft would also have been wrapped in wire or string to help prevent it from splitting apart. So I'm going to try and do that with this piece of wire. It might be a little bit thick to do it, but I'm going to try it. So you can see I put a 90-degree bend in the end of the wire. I'm going to clamp that into the vise. I'm going to try and get it to start in that gap in between the head and the shaft. Unfortunately, that didn't really work with the wire, so I've had to use just some normal twine to wrap around the head. I was finding that the wire was just too thick to get the tie-off loops to work, as with the tie-off loop you have to pull the wire through, and it's just too thick. It doesn't want to be pulled through like string. So maybe if I had some thinner wire that would work better, but unfortunately that was all the wire that I had, so I've ended up using some twine just to finish off the head and add that little bit of string and that little bit of wrapping around the actual shaft. I've done the same with the fletchings, so I've wrapped around where they come into contact with the shaft. I've first stick welded them on. So firstly I just tacked them on with the stick welder, and then to cover up those welds, wrapped it in a little bit of string. So that is it, that's the arrow done. Sorry, I didn't manage to make all of it out of steel, as I ended up using some string rather than a nice little bit of wire. I think it would have looked better with some wire, but I just don't have anything really that's going to work for it. I think it still looks pretty cool, and I suppose the string's a bit more in keeping with how they would have actually been made. But I mean, at the end of the day, this is never going to be shot out of a bow. It's way too heavy, and the fletchings would almost certainly just ruin your bow. So I do like making things that are influenced by historical items, and so granted this is never going to be shot from a bow, but at least it has been influenced by history and by these arrows that were actually made and used. So the Mary Rose, which is what we based the shaft and the fletchings off of, that was a warship, and so the arrows on it were war arrows, hence why this is like a really chunky thing. You know, a half-inch 12mm shaft, that's a big diameter shaft for an arrow. But anyway, thank you for watching the video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next one. The next video might come out a little bit later, as I'm going to be doing sort of a bit of a bigger project. It's not going to be a massive project, like I'm wondering whether to do it in 2 videos or 1 video. Probably it's going to be 2, but there's obviously going to be a lot of filming and making involved in it, so it may be not next Sunday, and I realise that this probably isn't going to be coming out on Sunday now, as it's already Saturday today, and I don't think I'm going to be able to get it fully edited and uploaded tomorrow, so we're probably going to be coming out with this video a little bit late, but the next video is also almost certainly going to be a little bit late. But hopefully you'll enjoy the video once it's out, so please stick around and have the patience to then watch the video when it comes out. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.